My late husband worked 60-hour weeks to ensure this home would always protect our family. Decades later, our own son tried to use it to rescue himself from debt. He thought I would honor his father by giving in. He was about to learn the opposite. The roast chicken was still warm on the kitchen counter when Meredith slid the folders across my dining table. "When will your estate be mine?" she asked. Her tone was brisk, stripped of hesitation, carrying the precise cadence of an actuary calculating mortality risk. "Because we need to know the timeline, Evelyn. Living here alone on 3 acres in New Hampshire no longer makes logistical sense." I set my glass down on the linen placemat. My son Mark kept his head lowered carefully, carving his potatoes into uniform cubes. He had the same jawline as his late father, but none of the backbone. For 6 months, ever since they upgraded to a modern townhouse in Portsmouth, their weekend visits had carried this growing chill. "Take a look at the breakdown," Meredith insisted, tapping a manicured nail on the glossy covers. She slid 3 printed spreadsheets toward me. The first sheet listed the estimated equity in my colonial house alongside the exact amount needed to pay off their adjustable-rate mortgage. The second itemized my mutual funds and calculated my monthly grocery and heating expenses, down to the penny, as if to prove that living independently was financially inefficient. The third was a color brochure for Shady Pines, an assisted living facility 40 miles north near the Maine border. She had highlighted the entry-level single room in yellow marker. "This plan protects the family capital," Meredith explained, leaning back. "It frees up liquidity before your medical expenses begin eating into the principal." I looked at Mark. He reached for his water glass, his knuckles whitening, but his gaze remained fixed on his plate. He offered no defense, no objection, only silence. I did not raise my voice. I neatly closed each folder, stacked them into a single pile, and pushed them to the corner of the table. Then I picked up my fork and finished my dinner in total, deliberate quiet. The dinner was not an isolated incident. For over a year, Meredith had treated my home like a holding company waiting for liquidation. She started small after my husband Thomas passed. First, it was labeling the antique oak dressers upstairs with blue painter's tape during Thanksgiving, casually claiming she was cataloging heirlooms for insurance. Then came the constant inquiries about my quarterly tax returns and my pension from 30 years of teaching middle school biology. Every holiday became an audit disguised as concern. Mark had changed alongside her. He worked long hours at an engineering firm, exhausted and visibly strained under the weight of private school tuition for their daughter Lily and Meredith's escalating lifestyle demands. When Meredith spoke about real estate equity, Mark simply nodded along, treating his mother's home as an inevitable financial relief valve. The following Tuesday, Meredith called while I was pruning the hydrangeas in the front yard. "The director at Shady Pines has an opening for a walkthrough this Friday," she stated without greeting me. "I reserved a slot at 2. Mark can drive you up so you can sign the deposit paperwork." "I have my community garden committee on Friday," I replied evenly, clipping a dead stem. "Evelyn, you can garden anywhere," she sighed, her frustration crackling through the receiver. "The real estate market is peaking this quarter. If we list the property by May, we maximize the return before interest rates climb again. You need to look at the numbers objectively." "I look at my life, Meredith, not your spreadsheets." "You are being stubborn about an asset that will eventually belong to us anyway," she said, her voice turning sharp. "Why delay the inevitable when we are drowning in housing costs?" I did not argue. I hung up the phone and walked into my study, looking at the framed property deed Thomas and I had signed 30 years earlier. On Wednesday morning, I made my first concrete move. I did not call Mark to complain, nor did I demand an apology from Meredith. Instead, I drove 30 minutes into Concord to meet with Arthur Sterling, an attorney who had handled Thomas's affairs for decades. Arthur greeted me with warm familiarity, pulling my family file from a wooden cabinet. I placed Meredith's 3 spreadsheets directly onto his desk. He reviewed the highlighted figures, shaking his head slowly as he read the notes on Shady Pines. "She calculated your life expectancy against your property tax." Arthur observed quietly. She believes this property is an idle balance sheet, I said. I want to correct that assumption permanently. We spent 2 hours reviewing options. I had no desire to disinherit my granddaughter Lily, nor did I want to act out of spite. But I needed a structure that stripped Meredith of any leverage over my remaining years. We can establish an irrevocable living trust, Arthur explained, drafting notes on yellow legal pad paper. You transfer the title of the house and your investment portfolios into the trust immediately. You retain a life estate, giving you the exclusive right to occupy the property for the rest of your life. You are the primary beneficiary for all income generated. And the distribution after I pass? I asked. The house remains under the management of an independent corporate trustee, Arthur said. It cannot be sold to satisfy personal debts. Rental revenues will fund Lily's university tuition directly to accredited institutions. Mark receives a modest annual stipend, but the capital remains completely shielded from third-party claims. Draft it, I told him. Include a strict no-contest clause under state law. If anyone challenges the trust in court, their entire allocation reverts to the town library fund. Arthur nodded, already typing the initial framework into his terminal. 2 weeks passed while Arthur finalized the legal language. On a bright Saturday morning, Meredith arrived at my house unannounced. Mark was not with her. She stepped through the front entrance carrying a professional laser measuring tool and a leather-bound notebook. She walked into the living room without taking off her shoes, surveying the wide plank pine floors and the brick hearth. Mark had to work overtime, she said casually, clicking the device against the far wall. The red dot beamed against the mantel. I'm bringing an interior stager here next week, so I'm taking some initial measurements. Buyers prefer minimalist setups. I remained standing by the archway, holding a basket of fresh laundry. I chose not to physically block her path. I wanted to observe just how far her entitlement would carry her. Meredith didn't stop typing into her phone. Evelyn, we don't have time for sentimental delays. Our adjustable mortgage rate resets in 4 months. The monthly payment will jump by $1,200. Selling this parcel provides the liquidity Mark and I need to stabilize our portfolio. She walked past me toward the master bedroom, entirely indifferent to my presence. She spoke as if I were already an occupant of Shady Pines. You built a comfortable life here, she added, glancing at the family portraits lining the hallway. Now it's time for that capital to serve the next generation. That's how generational wealth works. Generational wealth requires generational respect. Meredith, I said calmly. She offered a tight, condescending smile. Respect doesn't pay a 7% interest rate. We are doing what is necessary. You will thank us once you are settled in assisted living without the maintenance burden. She finished her measurements in 20 minutes and left without asking about my week. I watched her silver sedan pull out of the driveway, noting every measurement she had taken in her book. On Sunday evening, Mark finally called. His voice was heavy, frayed around the edges by exhaustion and the impossible dynamic inside his household. Mom, he began, hesitating. Meredith said you were difficult when she stopped by yesterday. She walked through my private rooms with measuring tools, Mark, I replied. She treats my home like an estate sale while I am standing in the hallway holding my laundry. A long silence stretched over the line. When Mark spoke again, his tone was defensive, the practiced deflection of a man avoiding the core problem. She is just under immense pressure, Mom. The firm cut bonuses this quarter. Our payments are climbing. We are trying to plan ahead so nobody gets caught unprepared. Who is unprepared, Mark, you or me? You're 71, he snapped, frustration breaking through his usual composure. You can't maintain a wood stove and 3 acres alone through another New England winter. If you have a fall, everything falls on us anyway. We are trying to solve 2 problems at once. By deciding my address for me, by being practical, he said loudly. You are sitting on $800,000 in equity while we are drowning. Dad would have wanted you to help us. That was the moment the remaining illusion dissolved. Thomas worked 60 hours a week as a machinist to pay off this land, so our family would never face housing insecurity. He never intended our home to become a bailout fund for unchecked living expenses. Your father taught you to build your own foundation, I told him quietly, not to dismantle mine. Mom, please just sign the pre-listing agreement Meredith sends over. He pleaded, weary again. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I set the phone back on its cradle without another word. On Tuesday morning, I returned to Arthur Sterling's office. The morning sun lit up the mahogany conference table, where two paralegals stood ready as legal witnesses. Arthur presented the final document, the deed transfer, and the declaration of trust. I read every clause carefully. The language was clear, drafted strictly under New Hampshire estate statutes. The 3 acres, the colonial house, my investment accounts, and the family savings were officially deeded into the trust. I was named the lifetime beneficiary with the exclusive right to occupy the property until my death. Upon my passing, the property would not be liquidated. It would be managed as a rental property under an independent corporate trustee at Merrimack Valley Bank. All net proceeds would transfer into an educational escrow account dedicated exclusively to Lily's accredited higher education. Mark was allocated a fixed annual dividend of $4,000, contingent upon the trust remaining uncontested. Any legal challenge initiated by Mark, his spouse, or their representatives would immediately trigger the forfeiture clause, redirecting the entirety of the fund to the Town Conservation Committee. Once you execute this document, Evelyn, it is permanent, Arthur reminded me quietly. You cannot reverse this to gift capital to Mark directly later, even if they face foreclosure. I understand, I said. This is not done out of anger. It is done to ensure stability for Lily and boundaries for my son. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the execution line. The notary stamped the document with an audible click of the seal. Arthur had every signature videotaped, and an independent physician evaluated my mental capacity beforehand. I placed one certified copy in my purse, left the second with Arthur for recording, and kept the third for the dinner table. Then I drove back home into the afternoon light. The following Sunday, Mark and Meredith arrived together for dinner. Meredith brought a thick manila envelope, setting it prominently next to the salt shaker before taking her seat. We brought the listing contract with Keller Williams. Meredith announced, pulling out a pen. The agent is coming Tuesday for photographs. We also put down the refundable $500 hold on the private suite at Shady Pines. If we move quickly, you can transition before the first frost in November. Mark sat beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at the wall behind me, rather than meeting my eyes. It's the best offer we'll get for the property, Mom. The agent has cash buyers looking for property in this town. I brought out a pot of beef stew and served them both in silence. Did you hear what I said? Evelyn? Meredith asked, her voice tight with irritation. We need your signature on the listing agreement tonight so the agency can list the property on the MLS tomorrow morning. I heard you clearly, I said, setting the ladle down. Then let's get it done before dessert, Meredith said, sliding the contract across the table. You've delayed this long enough. Every month you stay here costs us potential investment returns. You need to start thinking about your family's future instead of clinging to old routines. I looked at Mark one last time, waiting to see if he would intervene, if he would ask his wife to show basic decency in his childhood home. He cleared his throat, looked at the contract, and said, "Just sign it, Mom. It solves everything." I reached into my bag beside my chair and pulled out the dark blue folder containing the recorded trust agreement. I placed the blue folder directly over their listing contract. "What is this?" Meredith asked, frowning as she opened the cover. "That is the recorded title transfer executed with Arthur Sterling last Tuesday," I said, keeping my hands resting calmly on the table. "This property is no longer held in my individual name. It belongs entirely to an irrevocable, living trust." Meredith skimmed the first page, her eyes darting across the legal phrasing. The color drained from her face, replaced instantly by red blotches of anger along her neck. "What did you do?" "I secured the estate," I replied. I retain exclusive lifetime occupancy. The house cannot be listed, mortgaged, or sold. Upon my death, it will be managed as a rental property with the income paid directly toward Lily's college tuition. You locked the equity. Meredith's voice rose sharply, losing all its corporate composure. We need that capital now. We have mortgage resets coming in 90 days. You had no right to tie up our inheritance without consulting us. It was never your inheritance, Meredith. It is my life's work. Meredith turned on Mark, slamming her hand onto the table. Say something. She just destroyed our entire financial restructuring. Do something. Mark stared at the document, his hands shaking slightly as he read the clause bearing the corporate trustee's seal. He looked up at me, his expression caught between shock and disbelief. Mom, why would you do this? We told you we were struggling. You both acted as though my estate already belonged to you, I answered, looking directly into his eyes. It never did, and it never will. You have a career and an education your father and I paid for. Use them. The dining room descended into absolute silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. This trust is invalid, Meredith hissed, gathering her papers with trembling hands. We will contest it. You were coerced, or you lack the capacity to make major transfers without family oversight. No judge will uphold this when Mark is your only surviving child. Read page 6, I said calmly. She flipped the page violently. Her eyes locked on the bolded, underlined text of the no contest provision. If you or Mark file a single petition in court, I explained, Mark's annual stipend is immediately terminated, and the remainder of the fund transfers directly to the town library endowment. Arthur Sterling ensured every procedural requirement under New Hampshire statutes was met with documented medical clearance. Meredith stood up so fast her chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. You selfish old woman. You would rather watch your son struggle with rising mortgage payments than give up 4 empty bedrooms. Meredith, stop, Mark said. His voice was quiet, hollowed out. Stop! She turned on him, her anger spilling over without restraint. You sat there and let her outmaneuver us. We are underwater on the townhouse because you insisted on buying near the coast, and your mother is sitting on 3 acres laughing at us. I am not laughing, I said, standing up to clear the dinner plates. I am setting a boundary that should have been established 5 years ago. Dinner is over. Please take your listing paperwork and leave my house. Mark stood slowly. He looked at the walls at the kitchen where he grew up and finally at me. For the first time, there was no spreadsheet between us, only the reality of his own choices. He turned and walked out the front door, Meredith, following close behind, slamming the screen door shut. The following months were quiet. The initial storm of angry texts from Meredith tapered off once their own attorney reviewed the trust documents and confirmed that the trust was valid, enforceable, and extremely difficult to challenge. Faced with reality, Mark and Meredith were forced to restructure their finances on their own. They sold their coastal townhouse, downsized to a modest 3-bedroom ranch in Dover, and adjusted their budget without relying on an anticipated windfall. Mark took on freelance consulting work on weekends, slowly learning the financial discipline his father had tried to teach him decades earlier. Our relationship changed permanently. The performative family visits, driven more by financial interest than affection, stopped entirely. 6 months later, Mark visited alone on a Sunday afternoon. He did not bring folders or spreadsheets. He brought his daughter Lily, who spent the afternoon running through the back orchard, collecting fallen apples for cider. Mark sat on the back porch steps holding a cup of black coffee. He looked tired, but the evasive look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded maturity. The new house in Dover is small, he said, looking out at the tree line. But the mortgage is fixed. We manage it ourselves. That is how it should be, Mark, I replied, sitting in the wicker chair beside him. I'm sorry about last fall, he added softly. I let things get out of hand. We don't need to revisit it. The boundaries are set, and they will stay set. He nodded, accepting the terms without argument. There was a distance between us now, a permanent scar from the pressure they had applied. But there was also peace. I looked out over the 3 acres Thomas and I had tended with our own hands. The house was secure. My granddaughter's future was protected, and the life I had built remained entirely my own.